Hi, welcome everyone. I might jump straight in. Thank you all so much for coming today to our webinar, Planning for Your Farm's Future. I'm Tani Burgess, the Carbon Farming Outreach Program Coordinator with Landcare Victoria. This webinar is the fourth on the benefits of understanding carbon for your farm. Working together with Agriculture Victoria, the 10 catchment management authorities. This is with the Carbon Farming Outreach Program, which is running events across the state to assist Victorian farmers to understand their emissions and the benefits of carbon farming. Whether it's 2025 or 2050, we all need profitable and sustainable farming for our food and fibre. Today, we're so lucky to be joined by our experts, Alison Kelly, Joel Chambers, and Angela Higgins, to share their experiences planning for their farm futures. Thank you all so much for being here today. I want to start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which the work of Landcare Victoria occurs. We're inspired by the legacy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as this land's first custodians. Today, I'm coming to you from Naarm on Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. We have a few housekeeping points. You can see the Q&A function. This is going to be how you get your questions to our presenters anytime through the whole webinar. I'd really encourage you to get them in early, as we're always going to have lots of questions, and getting them in early will mean we're more likely to get to them. You can also upvote or comment on questions. My colleague Sarah Vella with Landcare Victoria is also here to help you with this. So, to introduce our first speaker, we have Alison Kelly. Alison has over 20 years' experience in national leadership positions working on the climate change and environmental issues within the agricultural sector. She has worked with both industry and research organisations, including Dairy Australia, Horticultural Australia, and the University of Melbourne. She's also held chair and non-executive director roles for a number of non-for-profits, including Horticulture Innovation Australia and Climate for Change. In 2023, she was recognised as a finalist in the Women's Agenda Leadership Awards as an emerging leader in climate and sustainability, and is a member of the federal government's Voluntary Greenhouse Gas Emission and Reporting Standards Reference Group. Alison is currently working as the Farm Emission Specialist with AgVic, leading a small but high-impact team working directly with Victorian farmers to know, understand and act on their emissions. Alison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tani. Just getting my slides up, but I really appreciate the introduction, and it's great to acknowledge it's not just going to be my work I'll be presenting on here today, but also that of my colleagues across AgVic, as well as a couple of participants which have been involved in the pilot project that I'm going to be talking about, as well as anybody else who we've actually asked for advice while we've been delivering this project. Just wanted to acknowledge it's not just my work I'll be presenting on here today, but thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. I'll kick right in though, given time and everybody's valuable time of an evening. Thought I'd start with a bit of context, and I guess first an acknowledgement as well that this space, we're talking about carbon emissions, mitigation, can often feel quite overwhelming and confusing. There are a lot of terms, a couple of them listed on the slide: carbon neutral, emissions footprinting, carbon pricing, and there's lots of players that are asking something of producers. So whether that be offsets, emissions number, or evidence around emissions reduction. So we get asked these questions a lot from farmers about what is carbon farming and where do I start? And hopefully I'll get a bit of a chance to provide some clarity on some of these topics, but also, as I mentioned, so that we can hear from others who are working in this space and who we've partnered with as part of this on-farm emissions action plan pilot to try and make sense of this a little bit as we go. I've mentioned about questions here, but as Tani said, we also love to hear good questions. So there's no stupid questions in this space, and happy to answer them as we go as well. I guess what all the fuss is about from emissions and carbon, and what does that mean for us? There's really two key elements at play for agriculture, and we do talk about the need to reduce emissions, and mitigation is the sort of term we talk about. We've got markets and investors who are starting to price emissions reduction into their activities. They see this as a material risk to their business, and so effort and resources are actually being directed to reducing this risk, either through changes in financing criteria or their purchasing power. On the flip side, we also are going to need to continue to be adapting to this warming world. So a warmer climate will actually impact on agricultural production. So we do have an interest in making sure we can support actions to reduce this warming over time. But what does that actually mean, the so what here? We talk about it as an additional number, perhaps in your bottom line. So expect to be asked about your emissions. So if not now, in time, knowing and understanding your emissions number, and expecting that the supply chain and consumer interest in low emissions product options are going to increase over time. So where possible, acting on your emissions and protecting any sinks is something that we can work towards. And that whole space is actually where the Agriculture Victoria on-farm emissions action plan pilot came into the picture. It commenced in 2021 as part of a wider state government emissions reduction pledge. And this project aimed to work with 250 farmers across Victoria to help them understand this space. Since that time, the project has worked with 230 farmers one-on-one to develop their emissions profile and their own customised action plan. And we've also then supported 132 of those farmers through to an action plan grant, which is either in delivery or has been delivered as part of this. The project itself also has been really focused on building capability across the sector. So we have upskilled 38 advisors and a wider network of about 208 members of our community of practice on emissions action planning. And the maps on this slide demonstrate the breadth of farmers that expressed an interest in this project, the different industries that they come from, and also the catchment locations. So a really rich piece of work that we've been able to do with these participants in a two-way project so we can learn from each other in what we can do from here on in. So what did we do? We tried to turn all that complex noise and all those questions that I posed at the beginning into something that was actually trying to make sense of this at the farm scale. And we talk about the address being addressing the gap of this making sense from a farm perspective. So we know that there were calculators, there's carbon neutral training programs, we already have industry efforts in R&D in place. That information was there and leading farmers were already implementing those actions. But the connection of all of these activities into a simple, usable, farm-level format was what was needed. And so that feeling of where do I start, helping those that maybe have already done an emissions assessment, but how they could cut through to what they could do about that. And what we heard was that they were actually seeking practical advice from a trusted source. So through these initial consultations and the one-on-one visit, we captured this through a know your number, understand your number, and act on your number theme, noting that farmers are going to be at very different stages of this process and would need advice across these areas. So approach really evolved to meet this need of wherever each of our participants were up to. In this presentation, I'm going to try and focus more on that final step, the action step. But before I do that, I'll just get us started a little bit more on the topic and some of the terminology I'll be using as well. So what are the emission sources and sinks on a farm? This image gives an outline of the complex biological processes that are happening on farm that contribute to these farm-related emissions in the form of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide from fossil fuel use. It also includes the embedded emissions from upstream inputs that are used for production. On the right-hand side, we also have the sinks, where carbon is drawn down and sequestered within the farm boundary. This is unique to agriculture. It's the ability to be both a source and a sink of emissions. At the farm level, the relative size of each of these sources will vary widely depending on the type of products that are grown, the farming practices that are being employed, natural factors such as weather, topography, hydrology. So there's a lot of short-term cycling that's actually happening between the farm and the atmosphere. And what we're trying to do when we're talking about calculating emissions and estimating emissions, these calculators are actually trying to estimate the loss of greenhouse gases from these systems. The process that it talks about is looking at converting all of those greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's methane, nitrous oxide, or carbon dioxide, into one equivalent number. And that is expressed as a carbon dioxide equivalent. And we call this that common currency when we're talking about a carbon footprint. And so when we actually look at a farm scale, and we want to be starting to think about it from a farming system perspective, we've pulled this together, this infographic that's on the slide, to try and simplify those sources and sinks from a farming system, but to align it to the types of carbon accounting methodologies that we need to align to. So those are international and nationally aligned rules that need to be followed when we're doing a carbon account or an emissions profile as part of the project. At the farm scale, this requires an understanding of the farm system, its annual inputs and outputs, and also the seasonal conditions. So as I mentioned, a lot of that short-term processes, we're trying to simplify and look at those in a really simple fashion as much as we can. So this infographic, I'll just go through and explain when you hear about those scopes of emission, what it actually means. So when we talk about scope 1, it's all of the emissions on farm from an agricultural activity. In this instance, I've included a livestock system, so it will look a little bit different depending on the system, whether you do have livestock or a non-livestock agricultural system, but it's any activity in the form of those losses. And scope 2 is the emissions from the production of purchased electricity that's being used as part of that production system. When we then include scope 3, we're then talking about those emissions associated with production inputs such as fertilisers, herbicides and other inputs that are brought onto the farm. And the final element that makes up this footprint is the sequestration, so the sinks we were talking about in the prior slide. And it's really about trying to quantify any annual change in carbon stores that have happened on the actual farm itself. And like I said, all of the calculators are trying to convert that into its common currency, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent number, or your net footprint emissions number. So when I said that infographic was a livestock system and that for other systems it's going to look really different, I've included here a couple of examples from other sectors that we've worked with within the pilot as well. Moving into these more intensive and plant-based industries meant we did have to evolve our templates, make sure that we captured horticultural producers, for example, that might have had on-site processing facilities or cool rooms, and consequently sources of emissions and refrigerants and energy use that might be greater than a livestock's emissions profile. Thus, there's been a lot of tailoring of emissions as we've been going. But I guess in terms of all of this, it's about trying to make sense of this and make sure that we can actually talk about this from a farming system perspective. So another question we got asked often was, how can I get my own number? Where do I start in when I want to conduct an emissions assessment? As I mentioned, we trained about 38 staff and external contractors in doing this, and a core piece of feedback from the participants is that they liked the one-on-one conversations, but it often did take quite a bit of time and resources to collect those farm records and the data that was required. That was one of the limitations, and you can see on the left-hand part of the slide here is just an outline of the types of data and records that are required to go into an emissions assessment. So it's not insignificant, but we did go through a process of supporting participants through that process. And the key message we really got from that is just start. Start collecting the data. Start by knowing your number. If you don't have data, there are proxy and default values that could be sourced from seeking some advice. And I really like this quote that we got from a staff member. It was, "I was definitely under the water for a good portion of the first part of my involvement in this project. I had no idea what I was doing. I hadn't used a tool. Really, it wasn't across greenhouse gas emissions at all. You could send me to how many carbon neutral courses all you like, but I still had no idea until I actually just got stuck into it." It's a really good, useful tip to just think about if you haven't already conducted an emissions assessment. The other piece of info is that there are existing calculators for your industry, for your farming system. Many of them are freely available. Some of them are online or Excel based, but they do exist and they can help you to calculate and estimate your own number. There's also industry benchmarks that are also available. And so one of those things that you can link through is quite often those are made available via industry groups. So once you've done something like that process, Quite often when we were at the one-on-one visits, the very next question we would get was, how do I compare? I've got my number. Is it good? Is it bad? Do I want it lower? Should it be something else? And it is difficult when we're talking about a total number of carbon dioxide equivalents, because that's obviously going to be a bit of a factor of scale. So quite often then we would look at a benchmark called an emissions intensity benchmark. This is the amount of greenhouse gases produced per unit of agricultural output. So in a livestock sector, that would be per kilogram of live weight, or in a cropping per yield. This is also a bit of a measure against that sort of production efficiency. So even if a farm does actually have high total emissions, it can also have a low emissions intensity if it produces that more efficiently. The value of an emissions intensity figure is it can be used to compare the emissions of different farms, and some of the industries actually do publish an emissions intensity figure within their sustainability reports, and it helps us to also identify where there might be inefficiencies in a system. I guess for a number of the industries that we visited, we did find there weren't very reliable industry benchmarks. And so when, in the absence of that, we did talk to individuals about what could 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent represent. And I find this graphic just a little bit interesting in thinking about, well, 1 tonne is, one person's one-way flight from Paris to New York, or is around equivalent of electricity use in certain locations. So just trying to compare and make sure that you understand your number was a really important part of what we did as part of the pilot as well. So when we were going through the process with our pilot participants, we would run through their emissions profile, a little bit of terminology like I've just run through with you. But one of the things that we really wanted to move quickly through into is, well, what could you do about this? What are the types of actions that are possible now? And I'll go into a little bit more detail about this from our 230 participants that were able to get an action plan. So the first point really here is that all farms and their needs and their actions will be different. We needed to tailor our plans, and this image is just a front page of what our template sort of looks like, but every single one of them were bespoke, were different. And that is because everybody's at a different starting point, as I said at the beginning, but also the purpose of this is to make sure that we gave participants the confidence that they were able to know their number, that we had gone through a process with them to prioritise their next steps. But also this action plan was a next step for them to be able to apply for an action plan grant. So needed to be evidence-based and relevant to their system and where they were at now. So the plans included their emissions number, a benchmark, the commentary on their sources and sinks, options for actions, and also included a little bit of information about a carbon stock estimate, even though we did not do a formal carbon baseline for a offset, for example. The emission goal, we linked it back to their longer term business objectives, and we actually made sure that they were able to get a really high level snapshot of things that they could do now and link into their action plan grant. We found that these plans really were a starting point. They didn't provide all the answers. That really wasn't what we were there to do, but it was about trying to provide options that were available now, but also to point them towards some of the future opportunities that were coming through the R&D pipeline as well. In describing the options that are available, we use this pathway to emissions reduction as a guide. The first arrow in this pathway describes the need to improve emissions intensity. So current industry targets and best practice support guides often focus on emissions intensity first, because it is that common unit and also does align well with productivity goals for those industries as well. So it was important that we made sure that we aligned with what industry messages were out there, and that we were able to consider what we call the 1 to 2% gains that were possible to do now. However, we also wanted to acknowledge that, the atmosphere is actually what we're trying to change here. It responds to total emissions. This doesn't discount the long-term need for emissions intensity focus as well, but we do want to be looking at absolute, so permanent emissions reduction. So the second arrow in this recommends ways to reduce those absolute emissions where possible. And the final two arrows relate to carbon sequestration. So that ability to either increase carbon stocks on the farm through trees and soils, but also the ability to look after any existing stocks of carbon that might be in the landscape. Those are both important aspects of wider landscape scale action to manage carbon in the farming system. And so it was part of a whole process of trying to capture actions for them across all four of those areas. The next step we worked through was actually how we could help prioritise actions. This is where our farming system knowledge of the team has been quite valuable, and a good insight from the work is that tying back greenhouse gas emissions to a loss or an inefficiency in the system was actually a really good way to kind of flip the switch and think about how emissions actually work from a farming system lens. So the image in this slide at the moment is a snapshot of one of our facilitator worksheets. So sorry, it is a little bit small, the writing there, but just as an example for how we went about identifying inefficiencies was something like this process where we would get an individual participant to self-rate how they were actually going against some of these drivers of emissions that we know about. They were able to then put their own self-rating lens on that, have a think about what was relatable to them and tying it back to their production goals. And because we know that those emissions were a loss from the system, this process really did help us to identify those efficiencies and where some of those win-wins could come into it as well. I mentioned as well that we did see horticultural and intensive systems that might have included processing and cool storage post-harvest facilities. We also made sure that we identified opportunities for inefficiencies in those systems as well. So a separate sort of sheet we needed for those, because obviously that's focused more on things like energy use, the types of refrigerants that are used in those cool storages, and also insulation and just design of those facilities and infrastructure that's on site. So what does this look like in practice? If we were focusing on do now efficiencies, and again, I've included a livestock example here, and then I'll bring up a little bit more information about a non-livestock opportunities. We've tried to put in this slide as many of the types of efficiencies we've identified by emission source. So you can see aligned to the infographic there, we've got scope 3 purchases and opportunities to reduce those, how we could reduce that through the herd and individual animal targeted strategies for those livestock sectors and intensive sectors that might have had losses from the system from effluent management. We also had actions that align to design reuse of nutrients on farm, and then nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. So those inputs into the system and how we can reuse where possible, look at alternative products and minimise the impacts from any of those inputs into the system. For a non-livestock industry, where it might be much more focused on energy use and input use, we also were able to describe some of the actions that were possible on the farm there. These systems often had more of a focus on reduction in fossil fuel use, whether that be from energy or machinery, vehicles, and also around scope 3, which, as I mentioned, was sort of embedded emissions from purchases, which might have been in these systems, also included things like packaging or growing medium and materials that were brought on as part of their production systems. So that this added a bit of complexity to what we did, but I guess in terms of looking at it from a whole value chain was something we tried to do when we were looking broader and beyond the livestock sectors. So what I'll pivot to now is also talking about the types of projects that our pilot participants decided to implement on their farm. I mentioned earlier that as part of the project, we were able to deliver 230 customised action plans. Each of those participants were then offered the opportunity to take up an action plan grant, which was a $16,000 matched grant for them to be able to implement one of the actions identified within their action plan. So as part of that project, we actually did have 132 of our participants take up that opportunity. Because of the cost of some of the actions that we undertook, there's actually more actions that have been selected. So there's actually 174 listed in that table on the left-hand side of the types of actions that were undertaken as part of this grant process. You'll see for those that were the highest priority, the most common types of actions, they really are targeting those sources of emissions, both in terms of livestock methane, but also in terms of the do now actions that are possible around tree planting, but also improving soils within the landscape. So not a surprise in terms of what is actually available, the types of actions that can be possible to do now. But interesting that the remainder of projects also still looked at those sources of emissions around nitrous oxide through reduced use of fertilizers or energy use efficiency. There was work that was done on effluent management, as well as looking at opportunities that also reduce purchased inputs from the broader supply chain. It would be a bit remiss for me to say, like, we're still partway through this process. We're still learning about the types of projects that are coming through. As I mentioned, some of those action plan grants are still in delivery and haven't been completed as yet. But just from the initial survey responses from those that have already gone through this process, 88% of them said that they would recommend their project, that others implement the same project that they did, and that 93% of participants felt that they had achieved their original aim with being involved in the project, which is really positive. And I guess when we start to talk about confidence and acting on farm to reduce emissions, they're really positive responses from the piece of work that we did. I think the key thing to note, though, that we do often find that these actions are all interconnected. And so one of the things that we have described is within each of the action plans is that when looking at an action and prioritising those, make sure that there's not going to be a trade-off from that action somewhere else in the system. So just being careful that emission reduction in one area doesn't potentially cause increases in another area as a result of that action as well. I'll now go through just a little bit more detail. I'm just conscious of time. Just do a check. Okay, so we've got a bit of time there, which is good. So I'll go through a little bit more detail of the types of projects, again by source, and just to give a little bit more depth into the types of work that we described for participants as part of our pilot project. I'll kick off with livestock, but it's not all just about livestock in the next couple of slides. But I guess the key thing here, livestock as quite a significant source of methane, especially within livestock emissions profiles, can be anywhere from 80 to 90% of their emissions profile. So it was something that we did spend a bit of time on and talked about the types of drivers that actually result in methane emissions from a livestock sector. So we do talk about what are the types of levers that are possible to reduce these emissions, and those have been listed on the left-hand side of the slide here. So getting rid of any poor performing animals so that, again, they're not on farm producing methane, potentially not being as productive as possible on the farm, looking at where there are further efficiencies in herd management, whether that's reproductive efficiency, looking at calving and marking percentages, looking at weaner management, and looking at weight gain and how we can reduce time to turn off for some of those animals. And then sort of in the longer term opportunities, looking at genetic improvements or looking at the solutions that might be available for the system in regards to feed additives. And if they're not yet readily available, monitoring those solutions for when they are available for the type of farming system that they have. So on the right-hand side, I've included a couple of the projects, a little bit more detail about the types of funded pieces of work that were done through the action plan pilot. So we saw people actually getting livestock handlers and auto drafters, OptiWay systems, but also looking at genomic testing and performance and recording software to support those emissions reductions from methane. We also saw opportunities for looking at feeding system improvements. When we talk about that, it doesn't sound like something that's actually directly reducing emissions, but it is around improving feeding and the nutrition of animals at key times. So we recommended stock containment areas and how they can help with looking at finishing animals, whether or not they're holding animals in certain emergencies, and whether or not it also provides an opportunity for that farm to be feed additive ready when those solutions are available and viable for the business. So we did see some participants take up stock containment areas, looking at the opportunity of lick feeders that might have methane reduction solutions in them, and also looking at the nutrition of animals, the overall agronomic mix that they look at as part of their farming system. For those systems that were more intensive, so in our project, we did go and visit dairy farms as well as piggeries, where manure is actually one of their major sources of emissions. We did actually talk about opportunities for improvement of their effluent design, or whether or not nutrients were being reused as efficiently and effectively as possible across the whole farm system, and also looking at further opportunities for larger significant reductions like covered anaerobic ponds and biogas. I think given a little bit of the bias of our action plan grant being a $16,000 one-to-one, some of those latter options were probably a little bit outside of the scope of opportunity within this, but we did see participants take up the opportunity to improve their irrigation systems to allow for further reuse of nutrients from their effluent system across the farm and matching that better to the plant requirements. We had some that expanded lagoons and further pipe work so that they could, again, as I mentioned, get the effluent across a bigger irrigation area, and others that implemented some mechanical improvements. I mentioned the interconnectedness of some of these. I've got two slides, one about pastures and soils, obviously noting that some of these could kind of go where, in one or the other. We're all talking about sort of one system, but when we do talk about pastures, we know that species, composition, varieties, and the potential for some of these low methane pastures in some systems is the opportunity here. We also talked about grazing management, and so some of the actions that we actually saw, which were quite popular, was around paddock subdivision for improved utilisation and grazing management. So that was in the form of fencing and some water infrastructure that allowed for that on the farm. We also talked about variable rate technologies and precision application, as well as potential for further improvements in fertiliser efficiency as a result of those. So the right-hand side, as I mentioned, paddock subdivision was something that was taken up, as well as looking at other species that could be included within that farming system as well. And the flip side, we also saw a fair number of participants interested in further understanding their soils. So whether or not that was from a carbon perspective, but also around it, the opportunity where there were improvements that could be made to some paddocks. And so where possible, opportunities were taken up for soil testing for nutrient and soil mapping, the use of variable rate technologies for more precision applied fertiliser and lime use. We had participants also look at and be interested in undertaking baseline soil carbon measurements to explore the current levels and maybe track whether or not there was further opportunity for improving soil carbon levels over time. We also looked at soil moisture probes and weather stations, as well as works to reduce waterlogging and draining, so that was less of a potential source of emissions on the farm. Now, I did mention we also saw other industries as part of our project. We did have a round with cropping and grain producers. A fair number of the participants in that were also mixed farms, so it was interesting to find that from a cropping perspective, some of the actions I've already mentioned and those that are on the left of the slide were not necessarily their first priority to take up. We found mixed farm quite often focused on livestock as their first point of action. So whether that was live weight measurement, looking at further data requirements so they could better record and capture information on their livestock enterprise, also stock containment areas, grazing management and shrubs. So we sort of saw a bit of a flip. That was an interesting perspective where for those that were mixed enterprises, they really did want to focus more on some of those livestock actions over the cropping focused actions. In terms of trees, I mentioned it was one of the top action areas that were undertaken. We did see a really broad range of percentage tree cover across the farms that we visited. Some, quite low in terms of percentage, all the way up. I think we had one participant who had 25% of the property covered in trees. So real big, broad range. And so where possible, we did talk about opportunities for further sequestration. We know that carbon sequestration through trees does plateau over time as the trees age, but it can still be a very important inset to think about. So whether that might be through management and protection of existing sources, or whether or not there's further opportunity for shade and shelter or some farm forestry to be incorporated into the business. So participants did take up that opportunity. We did have some people look at natural capital assessment and tree advice, also had fencing and revegetation around waterways, as well as some solar for livestock water and infrastructure that was tagged to some of that fencing and revegetation work as well. From an energy point of view, within some systems, that was a small component of their emissions, but a lot higher in some of those more intensive systems that we saw. We know fossil fuel use is a key driver there, whether that be vehicles, machinery, electricity use. For those that are irrigated, there was a bigger proportion that was from energy, and also those that might have had heating, cooling, or post-harvest requirements on their farm. So where possible, if that hadn't already been undertaken, it was recommended that they look at perhaps an energy audit to check what electricity and fuel was used and whether there were opportunities for further automation to look at reducing use over time. Regular maintenance, promoting efficient use where possible, and also thinking about the future around electrification if that was an opportunity, or renewables. So we saw participants take up that opportunity for energy audit. We saw some irrigation and some renewables put in place. We had variable speed drives put on pumps, also the further adoption of renewables, and some cool room upgrades being taken up. And then the final sort of area I've talked about scope 3, so those upstream embedded emissions, thinking about where possible, reducing the amount of inputs that are brought onto the property. So whether that's through further homegrown feed that can be utilised, or whether or not there are alternative products that could be purchased with a lower footprint that comes over to into their emissions. So we did have some participants that looked at increasing their homegrown feed to reduce the need for their supplementary feed purchases. We also had those that really honed in on fertiliser efficiency and alternative products to reduce the amount of inputs that they were purchasing, as well as some in vineyards that were looking at recycling, composting on farm to be able to reduce again some of those purchase inputs. But noting there is a bit of a trade-off there, because as composting can also potentially be a source in some instances as well. So that's a pretty quick whiz through of, about 132 pilot participants' actions that they've done on farm. Happy to share those at any time. But I guess the key point wanted to take away is that there is still opportunity to think about, well, what does make sense for you and what's relevant for your system. So if I was going through that process again and perhaps had another version of the pilot, these are the types of things that we would have been working through to make sure that you can perhaps put together your own emissions reduction action plan. It is thinking about what your endpoint and your purpose is. So if you are actually doing that for access to market or access to capital, or meeting compliance with a carbon farming scheme, there might be just some different evidence and requirements around what's required to go into an action plan. So making sure you get that right before you start is an important part. But if it's about prioritising actions, it's starting with what are your areas for improvements? What are the things that might fit within your whole farm plan if you have one? And if not, we have recommended for some participants to go back and revisit and do whole farm planning course for that reason. What other things could you break down into some smaller steps? So again, looking at those 1 to 2%ers, or those opportunities for efficiencies that you can do now, which could be the win-wins opportunities. If you've got a list, what are the high, medium and low priorities, and looking at which level of investment might be required across those, and whether or not you do have the evidence base behind those to be able to validate an emissions reduction from any of the actions that you undertake. I did mention a couple of times, but it is important to think about what you can do now as well. We know emissions are a loss from the system. There are opportunities to improve efficiencies and also look at emissions reduction. So consider those first. Think of them as those 1 to 2%ers that can get you towards the sort of net zero approach that we've talked about already. And if it's sort of last couple of slides, I guess, Tani, and then happy to pass it on. But some key considerations for us is that really focusing in on the win-wins. Sorry, those ticks are all in the wrong spot, but that's fine, neither here nor there. But really we talk about good business management being about good carbon and emissions management. So you do need to think about where those opportunities are for looking for inefficiencies in the system first. We do recommend that you do need to also know your number, whether that's at a really high level estimate or you get some help in to do that. You really can't manage what you don't measure already, and getting a starting point on your benchmark will also mean that over time, as improvements to tools happen and as this immature market kind of does start to evolve, that you'll be able to perhaps look at some of those rolling averages of your figures and look at the trends of your numbers over time. So a good starting place is understanding, first of all, your data requirements and getting that good record keeping that's sitting behind that too. There really aren't any negatives for acting on those do now options. We are starting to see already that there are financial incentives perhaps available, and some of that supplier preference status coming up. We have had participants already been asked for their number through their supply chain. So that is already happening as we speak, and so will only increase over time. It is a lot to take in. There is a lot changing. There's mandatory reporting requirements, which I haven't even touched on here today. Lots of other things to think about, but not getting distracted by that change that's happening. There is a lot going on, but the starting point here is knowing your number, understanding those drivers of your number on your system, and what are the things and levers that you could pull to be able to make that change on farm. And I guess the key point here is not about ignoring that climate adaptation will also be a challenge. So where possible, seeking advice or looking at how climate risk might change over time and how that might impact on emissions as well. And we have found this with some of our participants, but there is a bit of disappointment and judgment when you do your emissions number, that feeling of, oh, it's like, it's big or it's a big number, and being judged about that. But it is only one metric. We know that lots of participants are already doing great activities on farm to manage their carbon, be sequestering that already within their business and in setting where possible. So continue with those existing activities that support efficiencies and co-benefits on your system. And I'll leave here with just, I guess, the last final point. We heard all the questions from beforehand, but we're about to hear from pilot participants and others that are already doing work here. It is really important to have these conversations. Really great to ask good questions. Really great to keep asking and have that mindset of seeking out more information. We obviously, as part of our pilot, we're lucky enough to be able to work and have one-on-one conversations with these participants, and some of the reflections from that up on the slide now. But I guess what we still heard from individuals is that it is a lot to learn. There's a lot of information and jargon that can feel overwhelming, but having someone that you trust to talk through that with you, that you can seek advice from. And we have already had participants come back to us and ask questions, a year or two after we visited them, to just seek some further advice and guidance of where to next. So still recommend that that's a good way to keep learning in this quite complex space as we go. And just a bit of a plug for where further resources can be found. As I've mentioned, a couple of them through the slides, but we are in the process of developing up workbooks to go through those drivers. So that slide that was a little bit too hard to read about the self-rating, we're trying to turn those into workbooks to be more readily available beyond the project as well. And that's it from me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alison. There was so much incredible detail for those wanting to get started with their action planning on their farms. For anyone who wasn't sure on any of those topics covered, so soil, trees, calculating your on-farm emissions, we actually have a whole range of previous webinars covering some of these topics. And I guess we're also so lucky that as part of our carbon farming outreach program, we have Alison and a whole range of AgVic experts actually coming along to in-person events all across the state. So if you're able to have a look at our carbon farming outreach calendar, you might be able to see something coming up near you, or register for updates when you do have events happening within your CMA. So there's always an opportunity to learn more, and I'm sure that you will have plenty more questions to pop in the chat. But as Alison spoke about, we have a couple of fabulous farmers today who have been working to not only lower their emissions, but increase their productivity and efficiency. So I'm just going to hand over to Joel. Joel, I know you've been having a few issues with your video. Is everything going okay now?
Yep, should be okay.
Awesome. I'll let you start sharing screen while I read a bit about your introduction. Joel Chambers is a 7th generation farmer and Vineron. with Chambers Agriculture and Viticulture, a Rutherglen-based contracting business that delivers sustainable viticultural and agricultural services to grape growers, winemakers, and farmers. Joel runs 200 acres and leases 1,000 more for lamb and fodder. He's one of only 5 contractors nationwide offering under-vine straw mulching, and Chambers Ag and Viticulture helps clients achieve sustainable wine growing and carbon neutral certification, proving sustainability isn't just ethical, it also boosts resilience and results. Joel, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Tani. And yeah, thanks, Alison, for that presentation as well. I'm just checking, is that screen sharing?
Yeah, all looks good.
Yep, beauty. Yeah, so I'm Joel Chambers. I'm from Lake Moonamere Estate, located in Rutherglen, and was part of the pilot program run by Alison and her team. So we've been out in Rutherglen for 7 generations now, and our current property was brought into the family in 1924. Topics of discussion they'll go over today. So we recently became carbon neutral certified in about April 2024. So I'll go over the decision-making process for why we went carbon neutral, our certification body, who was climate active, the steps we took to reach certification and the experience we had with the process, learnings along the way, and practical steps for grape growers that they can take on their properties straight away to lower emissions and improve sustainability. So the decision-making process for us was really broken down into 5 brackets or 5 main reasons. In the viticulture wine industry, we had to look at our business direction and values. There's already a certification process called Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, which is a really good gateway into carbon neutrality. It was sort of the next step for us after that. We'll focus in on the government pledge and reliance on net zero by 2050. We want to get ahead of that and really understand what is actually involved in carbon farming, climate active certification. Looked at consumer values and increased market access for our product, being wine. So steps we have taken to get to climate active certification. We have to investigate the process. The questions for us was, is it possible for a small business? We only produce about 60 tonne of wine grapes per year, which in the wine industry is classified as very small. What could we use from our current certification? We didn't want to double up on information, didn't want to double up on expenses either. And how could we simplify the process? Our next step was to engage a consultant to streamline and educate us through the process. We came in fairly blind. So we wanted to get started really quickly, and we felt that was the best way to go for us. Baselining emissions and deciding whether or not to certify our product, being wine, or certify our business, or both. So in the wine industry, we had the option of certifying just our product, being wine, but we felt without certifying the business, it would undermine the one certification for product. So we chose both. And then the last process we had to do was choose a certification body. That took quite a while to figure out which certification body was best for us. We chose Climate Active initially purely because they were the government-run agency. Learnings along the way. So carbon inventory and carbon calculating, which Alison just went over quite a bit. In the wine industry, our biggest emitter is Scope 3. So that was a really interesting process, actually seeing, for instance, an example, most wineries have a cellar club. That's where our Scope 3 emissions came from, getting the wine to the consumer. Types of certifications, business and product, reporting periods, and true ups. So a true up is essentially after you do your initial carbon inventory, instead of doing it all over again, you just update the information. It's just a quicker way of doing it. And then the last one is, what areas are our big emitters of carbon? So we found 23% of our total 94 tonne emitted for our business and product was attributed to agriculture, being wine production, grape growing, and a little bit of mixed farming went into that as well. But yeah, while 50% was Scope 3 emissions in wine transport to the consumer. So I'll just go through some practical steps that grape growers can take immediately to reduce emissions and improve sustainability, and basically start on the road to carbon neutrality. Everything that I'll outline or go over has worked really well for us, and it might not work for others, but it's having an effect for us. Cover cropping, straw mulching, crimping, reducing tractor runs, basically by putting the slasher away. So that's been really helpful for us. In viticulture, everyone likes to see a really nice, neat row, maintained cricket pitch type mid rows. The way we look at it is that's burning fuel. It's costing you maintenance on the tractor, plus it costs you a operator sitting in the tractor in labour. So the less you can do that, the better. Investing in efficient equipment. A lot of our equipment was single row. We've upgraded to twin row. We've halved our diesel usage. We've halved everything I just said in the tractor runs. Having an efficient biodiversity plan that actually complements your business and works with your business. Utilizing livestock for winter grazing where possible. Livestock are a fantastic weed control in viticulture during winter, and start to produce your own biostimulants and fertilizer. So cover cropping. Multi-species mixes are often preferred, but not vital, I find. I go for multi-species that also has grazing potential to maximize weight gain for sheep and lambs. So that goes hand in hand with the sheep and lambs are in your vineyard over winter for weed management, keep the grass down. While they're in there, you may as well try and make them put on weight. So it's really good in our scenario to use leftover seed and any leftover seed from our broadacre cropping and mixed farming enterprise just goes into a big bundle and goes into the mid-row. So the benefits of that are enhanced soil health, increased biodiversity, enhanced beneficial insect activity. So that one's really important if there's no frost danger and you're actually allowing the cover crop to get to flowering, which in the photo on this slide, you can see that that's an annual ryegrass cover crop. It actually brings in all your beneficial insects, and that comes in right at the right time for the vine growth, and they start eating all your pests. So that works for you as well, but sometimes frost comes in really severe, sort of -6s come in, and you have to terminate your cover crop pretty quickly. Keeping ground cover. So crimping cover crops is very handy. If you have a crimper, just roll over it. It makes the cover crop go reproductive, creates about 30 centimeters of organic matter, and that protects what would be a bare row from the harsh heat over summer. Undervine organic matter. If you slash your cover crop and go straight undervine, you've got a really good mulch. Yeah, and then creep in, which I just went over. Straw mulching. This has really helped our business, especially in water usage and electricity costs for pumps. We have a lot of, or sometimes we have good wheat crops, sometimes not so good. So if they're good enough, we'll actually windrow the stubble. We'll go in there and bale it up, bring it over to the vineyard, and we invested in a really good straw mulcher that allows us to basically slice the straw into the mulcher and deliver it under vine. It's great for soil moisture. It's fantastic for weed management. Actually suffocates any undervine weeds. Reduction in water usage, that can be up to 50%. It's a really efficient way, especially in a drought year, if your allocation is only 70%, 75, even less. Increased soil health and worm activity. It should last for 4 years if it's applied densely enough, and it removes the need to herbicide under vine. So your savings in chemical, fuel, labour, and ultimately emissions are really beneficial. Biostimulants and fertiliser. So we found our freight and the cost of purchasing biostimulants off manufacturers was becoming really high. We were unsure sometimes whether or not we were getting the proper nutrients or the proper trace elements that we were looking for in viticulture. So we started to make our own. So in this slide, the photo there, those are actually worm farms. So they're capable of producing 1,000 litres each of worm juice. It's not the be all and end all. You still have to use quite a bit of other stuff, but it's all just about plant health, soil health. So every time you go out with a fungicide, yeah, 4 or 5 buckets of that gets tipped in as well. We found as well with creating your own biostimulants, dissolving urea at a rate to whatever you want to apply at. We find 30 kilograms per hectare is a good rate for vineyards. Look into dissolving it and applying it as a foliar rather than broadcasting. You actually get much better uptake, specifically in viticulture. And then, yeah, having your own worm farms, creating your own compost tea, and incorporating that with fulvic acid and kelp can really save you a lot of. It can save you financially, and it can also save you on freight costs. So cell grazing's been a really important part of our reduction in herbicide use. So we'll usually lock up about 2 hectares of our vineyard and then run anywhere between 150 to 300 sheep through that cell. It's a fantastic winter cleanup. So undervine in particular, any dry matter, debris that's there, the sheep will come in, get rid of that, provide you with organic fertilizer, and they also provide a diversity in enterprise and income. So whether it's agistment for grape growers or whether it's the sale of sheep and lambs for diverse businesses, yeah, it's a huge benefit. So the opportunities for wine producing businesses in carbon neutrality or even baselining your emissions, I find we're staying ahead of the pack. So it's front of mind for a lot of viticulture, wine industry people, where we're being asked already to present our emissions data, increase market edge, solidify your commitment to the environment that you operate in. The negatives of carbon neutral certification, the changing rules and regulations, not allowing insetting as an offset, cost from start to finish, consultancy fees if you utilise them, and ongoing costs of carbon neutrality certification. It's an annual certification fee. So where are we now? Currently at Lake Moodamere Estate, we are reviewing our carbon neutrality certification due to ongoing rising fees and charges through Climate Active. We're investigating certifying bodies to see if the cost can be reduced while maintaining certification for both our product and business. However, regardless whether we continue with certification, we as a team have learned a lot in the process and believe we can continue to make a difference in the emissions reduction area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel. I'm sure I'm not alone in being very relieved that we can have a carbon neutral glass of wine with dinner every now and then. Absolutely fabulous to hear about your experiences, and a reminder that we can pop any questions in the Q&A function. Joel, while I've got you here, I might just pass on one from Angela. How much traction across the industry has there been for all these methods?
It's been taken up fairly broadly. So I find from the mixed farming side of things to viticulture, regenerative viticulture is really big. We're able to experiment a lot at the moment. You might not be aware there's an oversupply of grapes in Australia. That does have its positives, while there are a lot of negatives. But we can experiment with regenerative techniques while the industry is down, and it may affect yields, but it won't matter so much. Yeah, the uptake's really good in the viticulture sense.
Great, that's really good to hear. And again, if you have any questions for Joel, Angela, or Alison, please just pop them in with that Q&A function. But speaking of Angela, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Angela has a beef farm, Pardue Cattle Co., in the foothills of the Otway Ranges near Colac with her husband Matt. Together, they guide a business strategy committed to the principles of regenerative farming, biodiversity, sustainable water management, and climate resilience. Running a commercial Black Angus beef herd, Pardue Cattle aspires to be a meaningful livelihood through regenerative farming. Natural capital assets like water purification, pest control, nutrient cycling, and climate regulation are valued as the backbone of productivity and profitability. As if that doesn't keep her busy enough, Angela is currently Secretary of the Central Otways Landcare Network, a member of the Corangamite CMA's Community Engagement Network, the Corangamite Rural Women's Network, and Colac Better Beef Group. Angela, thank you so much for fitting us into your schedule.
Oh, it sounds all overstated there, but thank you, Tani. And that was really interesting and fabulous, Joel. Unlike you, I don't have text on my photos today, so bear with me as I scroll through the slides. Have I got screen?
Yeah, it looks like it's working if you're just able to click.
Click.
Yep.
There we go. Yeah. Oops, it's jumped too far ahead. Okay, so Tani's done a very good job of introducing us. This photo on the right there shows that we're adjacent to a fairly large section of Otway State Forest, which is really beautiful. I can see it from my kitchen window. And Pardue itself also enjoys really high environmental values. It has a creek line running through it that eventually feeds into a Ramsar wetland down at Lake Corangamite, and over 163 species of birds have been recorded on the farm. The previous owner was a very keen birder, and we've inherited a fantastic sort of land care and biodiversity legacy, which we've taken very seriously since starting farming here. So as we've heard, farmers can expect harder and hotter years ahead. And indeed, even this week, the National Climate Risk Report confirmed that when it was released on Monday. We bought Pardue to be drought-free. It was in a high rainfall, like 950 mils a year approximately, rainforest type zone. But as the last 2 years have played out, we've been anything but that. We've had the roughest time here in, I think, over 50 years. And it was a real wake-up call. But having said that, we anecdotally were seeing things that confirmed that our approach and our systems of farming and all the changes we made are bearing fruit, and that there's hope. So I know comparisons can be odious, but compared to a lot of other farms around us, we seem to stay greener longer, bounce back from the drought quicker. We didn't have to bring in feed from other sources. We did benefit from destocking, most definitely. We're only running about 500 breeders and progeny at the moment. Normally that would be a much higher number. Even in the drought last year, we had spring rain and we were able to do some trade cattle in and out. So we feel like there's some resilience beginning to show or in the system. So I'll just run through 4 main overhauls or changes in our practice, our regen toolkit, if you like. A lot of the things we do are very similar to Joel. And then I'll touch on what we're doing about or not doing about emissions. Here's our lovely spring dam. This photo just really illustrates how the water sources on Pardue are all fenced. We have no stock on water. Creek lines are fenced, and this has a really lovely old mature sort of woolly tea tree Otway forest around it. So the first shift, the first thing we did to change was, to borrow Charlie Arnott's quote, was to shift the paddock between our ears. There's just, sorry, a bit of example of regenning in our gullies and riparian zones. We've continued to work with land care all through the last 10 years, and when we can and when we get help with grants and things, we keep chipping away at sections of the farm that are still vulnerable. So yeah, we started with changing the paddock between our ears. So that's our that's probably about 5 years old, that re-veg patch there, but there's a creek line running through that to our main creek line. So that's just an example of how we're continuing to protect our waters on the farm. Next one, there we go. Soil will save us. We were farming very mainstream until about 2017 and started reading quite a lot of literature. And then we became concerned with how to bridge being really commercially viable. I'm so sorry, that's someone trying to call me, and I'll just get rid of that. Can you give me back the screen there, please?
Are you having trouble changing it now, Angela?
I have lost the actual screen because of that incoming call. Hang on. I've got yeah, maybe if you go to the slides, but I can't see them. Reload page. I'll just do that.
No worries. I think
you click through and I'll keep talking. Yeah,
we can see them. Yeah, so you're still on your soil.
So we're still on the soil will save us. We just needed some Dutch courage and some know-how. We knew we wanted to make changes, but we just didn't quite know what to do. And we met with a chap called Kim Cruz from Regen Ag through a land care 3-day biofert course. And if you click onto that screen, I really would like to get my screen back, but that's very annoying anyway.
No worries, Angela. Do you want to take a second and you can give it a go?
I've just got
I think we're all happy to wait. a minute?
Yeah, I've just got the main Zoom screen there and not the images and everything else. The main thing is that I'm still audio on. Anyway, with Kim Cruz, we started mucking around with our own liquid biofertilizers. And soon after that, we went to a seminal regenerative ag conference here in Colac. And that was a total game changer for us. We met people who were practicing, met people who were educating, communicators, and it was able to sort of really, from there, we were able to supercharge our efforts in regen. The kind of things that we committed to after that was we upped our cell grazing, we increased our mob sizes, and we were running these huge mob sizes, several hundred cattle through our cells for intense but light grazing, so that they were sort of really acting as compost machines. We increased our paddock rest days, and we worked harder on maintaining a better stocking rate to carrying capacity. We then, if you go to the slide with the biofert plant and the soil key, we then decided to get really serious at scale with the biofertilizer. We mucked around in sort of 1,000-litre ICBs for a couple of years, and we invested in an 80,000-litre capacity plant and became fully fledged brewers, and started to see some real change in the way our pastures were responding. My husband tells me anecdotally, we sort of improved our dry matter production by 7 or 9 tonnes. And we replaced all our ploughing equipment with a soil key. I'm not sure if everyone's heard of what a soil key is, but it's a pasture renovator. Basically, it sows and it brings down the air with that, but it has minimal disturbance, and we use that with brought in a no-till approach and committed to 100% ground cover 100% of the time. And the last thing we did at this time was we met Grant Sims from Down Under Covers, and we really threw ourselves into the whole multi-species summer cover crops to start, and then now multi-species pastures. And they're sort of the main things, the biofert, the multi-species, the more intense grazing, but with longer rest periods of the paddocks. And the things that we've noticed that have changed on the farm, herd health increased. I just sort of noticed the vet bills weren't there anymore. We'd always put a lot of focus on herd health. Herd and pasture health were really our focus before all of this happened, and now it's much more about the soil and the roots and increasing the water cycle. Anecdotally, we have increased the water holding capacity across the farm. I think that's bared out in the fact that we've come out of the 2 years drought much less scathed, I feel, than a lot of people around us. And I do feel that if you manage for soil fertility and gain a 1% increase in your organic soil carbon, you increase your water holding capacity by 65,000 litres. And I really think that that's what's happening. The indications are that we're, through this soil health and herd health management, we are drawing down more carbon, and therefore we have a better soil water profile on the farm. I just noticed small things like the rain will come, but it will be another 5 days before I see the Aggie drains running that then feed down into our main dam. Yeah, and as I said, we were never brown or bare during the really hard 2 years that we've had. And so hats off to my husband for being brave enough to make all these changes, because we kind of did it overnight and turned a big corner. I'll add at the end here that the value of having an open farm gate. We have hosted a lot of not just land care workshop and field days, other events as well. And it's great when all the intellectual capital comes to you. It can be a lot of work on top of already your lot of farm work. So having these field days and things really keeps your kind of mojo going for it all. We've had more biofert recipe days with David Hardwick, who's quite well renowned. Central Otway Land Care Network did a Digging the Dirt on Carbon field day. We have had soil pit field days. I don't know if you click onto that slide there, I'm flying blind here. The soil pit field days were really interesting, and I'm looking forward to the chance to doing some better mapping of our soil profiles across the farm. And we've also invested quite a lot of time in farming and grazing for profit courses, attending natural capital field days for literacy, and meeting fantastic people. This is the thing, when you go to all these events, I know it's hard to make the time when you're farming, but by going to the events, you get to meet amazing people. This year we met Gabe Brown and Joel Williamson, such inspiring speakers, and they're things that can really help you move forward with the change. In terms of actual emissions, it was really great to hear Alison's presentation, because it reminded me, I felt like, oh, we really haven't been doing enough on the hard emissions like methane and fossil fuel emissions on farm. But I started to remember, well, we did an energy audit back in 2019, which was fascinating. No surprises. We found that diesel was our biggest emission. And Joel touched on some of the things you can do to reduce your diesel use on farm. We did some GAF tool training, so learning how to assess our carbon footprint. I have to say that was a couple of years ago. If I had to sit down and do it again, I'd find it really hard. But, you know, it's like learning a new language. You've just got to keep practicing and go back and do it again. As Alison suggested, I was hugely overwhelmed by what our emissions were because of the methane, and it felt like all these other things we're doing weren't counting. But I really do believe the 1%ers make a difference. I think we need to improve our data recording and need an action plan. I think we need to pick up from where Alison's talk was ending there, and benchmarking and monitoring. But I feel like it takes time to learn, and I've been circling the wagons, and I'm very familiar with all the language around this whole emissions space. Sitting down and doing the hard work, that's the next job. We haven't invested in baselining, and are pretty sure we're not going to pursue any soil carbon projects for the minute. I think additionality is a bit of an issue. You have to have a new project to get a soil carbon project registered, and we're already doing a lot of methodologies. And so, yeah, we do get rid of our poor performers. We do benchmark our calving and marking and follow our weight gain. And I feel like we are feed additive ready. So, yeah, there's still so much to do, but I feel like we've grown and changed and adapted a lot, and it's paying off. And so just to summarize, my last points of view would be that, from my point of view, I think active biology is a key contributor to not only your herd health, but to climate resilience and your sequestration capacity. I think farmers have a really exciting role to play in a climate smart age. Alison suggested mandatory reporting is coming our way. But I think reducing emissions through all the 1%ers does count. I really do believe in that. We have seen an adaptation difference on the farm, and I think this 2 years of drought has really given us a lot of confidence that everything we began has been worthwhile. And if I was to give any advice, I'd say challenge your paradigms, and maybe start with the low-hanging fruit, whether that's grazing management or backing off synthetic inputs or going to multi-species. And while there's no getting there tomorrow, if you read up, meet up, and get your key stakeholders on board, I think there's a world of difference we can all be making in ag. So thank you. And sorry if I read from my notes there with flying blind without the images.
Thank you so much, Angela. It's incredible you were able to do that without the slide deck. So very well done. I guess one key thing between yourself and Joel's presentations was biofuels. Have you noticed any other benefits from when you started using biofuels on your property?
To me or to Joel? To me?
I guess to you and Joel. Alison, also feel free to jump in.
Well,
I'm sorry, not biofuels, biofertilizers too.
Well,
sorry.
The biofertilizers, well, it's threefold. I think because we're using biofertilizers and not synthetic inputs, our soil biology is actually allowed to do its thing. And that increased soil biology is having very clear impact on our soil health, plant health. The bioferts also, we noticed insects aren't attracted to to strong plants, to complex sugars, and strong plants have complex sugars. So even though with liquid biofertilizers and coming off synthetics, you can't use herbicides and pesticides and things, we actually haven't needed to. And we're also a lot less fussed about weeds as well. They're doing a job. They've got roots that are doing things in the soil, and our mindset has changed from one of oh, there's a weed, quick spray it, to what's that weed telling us that the soil needs, and let's manage for what we want, not what we don't want. So it's a conversation we're always having, I suppose. Yeah, Glenn, our manager's funny. If he does see any pests around, he jumps on and sprays out the liquid biofertilizer to give the plants a quick sugar hit so that they're ready to fend off the pests.
Wow, that's such a cool way of getting multiple benefits. Joel, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, in a viticulture sense, we found biostimulants to be a game changer. Where we're able to put them on the cover crops, where like Angela said, it makes the plant a lot more resistant to pests and disease. With vines, your uptake area or your leaf contact is enormous. So that gives you a massive leg up. In particular, kelp and fulvic acid have been really useful. In the mixed farming or the broadacre sense, it's more a matter of 1%ers. So we've done a couple of trials of no synthetic fertilizer versus dissolving urea at a much smaller rate than broadcasting, and then comparing that to a broadcast conventional method. In this sense, it was for hay production, and we're still playing around in that area, but I certainly would not be taking I wouldn't be taking synthetic fertilizer out of the system in a broadacre sense. Not yet anyway, but yeah, it's amazing the difference between two enterprises and two types of farming.
I should say there, Joel, just to clarify, because I was rushing through it all a bit. We did gradually come off the synthetics, where it was all a bit too scary at first. But now we, based on soil tests, we will add a little bit of maybe urea or DAP. But as you said, hugely diluted as a liquid. It goes into the biofertilizer. And I didn't I rushed over this with the slides. There was the Toenfert, this marvelous machine from New Zealand, because I don't know if you've got this with your ferts, Joel. They can tend to be quite thick and sludgy, and the Toenfert has an agitator inside the tank, a bit like your Magimix in the kitchen, and adjustable nozzles on the spray arms, so you can get that fert out there. But originally it was clogging up all our old stuff. Yeah, we do pretty much the same as you as well.
Wonderful. And I imagine there's a bit of cost saving in not getting outside fertilizers in as well. Alison, did you have any other examples of farmers maybe adjusting their fertilizer usage in the case studies?
Yeah, look, we probably, I think we spoke a little bit about variable rate technology, so a little bit more around perhaps not alternative products themselves, but actually just about the total usage that was done. So I think part of that was coming through from looking at mapping and getting agronomic advice, and then precision applications that were matched to requirements. So we did have some of those, but I would probably argue that in many instances that was already happening. So was already something that had been addressed in many of the participants we'd seen.
Lovely. And I see a question from Ken in the chat. How do dung beetles improve carbon positions in the soil, or maybe just soil health more broadly?
I did respond to that earlier. We did do some analysis of that earlier on in the project, and I haven't done any recent analysis of peer-reviewed work of the quantification of that impact, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a practice that's potentially got other co-benefits in that use. I do know there's some quite active work being done to look into the quantifying that a little bit more, but yeah, sorry, that's not something I can help with.
No worries. I'm sure we'll all be more interested as more research becomes available. I guess a question for everyone is, do you have any advice on where to start? Angela, I know you spoke about the paddock between our ears. Do you have any tips or tricks you'd recommend for people wanting to start their journey on lowering on-farm emissions?
It can be overwhelming, and it has taken us time. Like, we started our shift in 2017 and we're still shifting. So just to not feel like there's a right and a wrong way, or that you've got to make a difference overnight. So as I was suggesting, picking the low-hanging fruit, I think if you're a livestock producer, herd management, grazing management is one of the most impactful things you can do. Gabe Brown talks a lot about, he does rest periods of up to 100 days. Our minimum here would be 30 days. And I'm always arguing with the guys for more. And there's this sense that you've got to have more animals to be more productive. But actually, if you're truly matching your stocking rate to your carrying capacity, and improving productivity through animal efficiency, weight gain, and that sort of thing, I think that's a good place to start. And I do love the multi-species. I walk around the farm and it's all flowers and fluffy, and the cows, where are they? They're up to. So yeah, that there's and keep connected to your local land care. I could not have done what we've done without our land care facilitator here, Andy Gray, and it's a great way to meet people and learn from people too.
Yeah, fabulous advice there, Angela. Alison, anything to add?
Yeah, look, I think it is a little bit of just getting into it. As I said at the end of the slides as well, there are plenty of resources. It's potentially not an information issue for starting out or perhaps looking at a tool. It might be if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed from that process, just seeking some advice if that's where you get stuck. But some of the tools are even now getting a little bit more user-friendly. They have started from a research point of view, so that's why they probably do feel a little bit overwhelming to start with. But there are some really good online ones and even some sort of short, quick kind of analysis ones that are available now. And I think just getting over that hump of, once you've know your number, that's something that you can work on.
Absolutely. Great advice. And last but not least, Joel, any final words of wisdom?
Look, in my experience, it can seem quite daunting. Really trying to open your mind to carbon farming and what's been asked regulation wise and knowing your emissions. What I would say from our experience is don't get too caught up on certification. Once you learn your emissions, really deep dive into how you can improve your emissions on farm from there. But because certification, until the auditing bodies start to be a bit fairer with their prices, it's just not feasible for a lot of farmers. But having your baseline emissions is fantastic knowledge, and that's the start.
Yeah, fabulous advice there too. I think everyone can join me in thanking our speakers for sharing their incredible experiences. I know we've already gone a few minutes over, but I'll try and wrap us up quick. And it's just so hard keeping to time when there's so much to share. Just a bit of a heads up, when this Zoom call ends, we're going to see you'll see a survey pop up. You'll also be able to scan the QR code that's currently on screen. Please let us know your feedback. We do find this information really, really useful, and it does help us shape these events to answer your questions and give you the information you need. So thank you in advance for taking the time to fill out the form. I'd also really encourage you to have a look at our Carbon Farming Outreach events page. There's always new events popping up every single day. The link should be right there in the chat, and if you can't see anything near you, you can definitely sign up for updates. So yeah, hopefully we'll see you at some events soon. A big thank you again to all our panelists, and a big thank you to our audience for giving up your Wednesday night, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you all so much.